The orders were carried out. This was the result. This was the way it looked. The ADL, the Armistice Demarcation Line. The unofficial frontier between the Israelis and the Egyptians, where the men of the United Nations Emergency Force watched and waited.
To United Nations Headquarters, New York, from Commander, United Nations Emergency Force, RAFA. Daily Situation Report, 1700 hours Zebra. Normal patrol activity carried out in all sectors along Armistice Demarcation Line. No unusual incidents reported.
Six months earlier, in October 1956, it was different.
To United Nations Headquarters, New York, from Chief of Staff, United Nations Truth Supervision Organization. Priority, Nation, October 29, 1956, 0200 hours, Zebra. Have received confirmation Israeli forces have crossed international frontier and attacked El Kuntia and Ras El Nab. Israeli forces have taken up positions west of El Nakal Road Junction in direction of Suez Canal.
In New York the next day, October the 30th, the UN Security Council meets while the world watches. The United States submits a resolution.
The government of the United States feels that it is imperative that the Council act in the promptest manner to determine that a breach of the peace has occurred, to order that the military actions undertaken by Israel cease immediately, and to make clear its view that the Israeli armed forces be immediately withdrawn behind the established armistice line.
This armed, unprovoked, and wholly unjustified attack on Egypt, after Israel had ordered general mobilization, constitute an act of war and demonstrates, beyond any doubt, the aggressive and expansionist aims of Israel's policy.
Israel is not out to conquer any new territory, but is determined to wipe out the bases in the Sinai wilderness from which murder and death and destruction are launched against her.
The United Kingdom and French governments have now addressed urgent communications to the governments of Egypt and Israel. In these, we have called upon both sides to stop all warlike action by land, sea, and air forthwith, and to withdraw their military forces to a distance of 10 miles from the canal. Further, in order to separate the belligerents and to guarantee freedom of transit through the canal by the ships of all nations, we have asked the Egyptian government to agree that Anglo-French forces should move temporarily, I repeat temporarily, into key positions at Port Said, Ismailia, and Suez. The governments of Egypt and Israel have been asked to answer this communication within 12 hours. It has been made clear to them that if at the expiration of that time one or both have not undertaken to comply with these requirements, British and French forces will intervene in whatever strength may be necessary to secure compliance.
Mr. Sobolev of the Soviet Union says that the ultimatum of the United Kingdom and French governments can only be described as aggression against Egypt.
Le président met donc aux voix l'ensemble du projet de résolution.
The President puts the resolution as a whole to the vote.
Que ceux qui sont en faveur de son adoption lèvent la main.
Will those who are in favor of its adoption please raise their hands?
In favor? China, Cuba, Iran, Peru, Soviet Union, United States, Yugoslavia. Abstentions? Australia, Belgium.
Will those who are opposed raise
Against? The United Kingdom and France. Because they are permanent members of the Security Council, their veto blocks the United States ceasefire resolution. The Egyptian government refuses the Anglo-French ultimatum to withdraw from the Suez Canal area. And on October the 31st, British and French bombers attack military targets in Egypt. In the early morning of November the 2nd, at an emergency special session, the General Assembly calls for an immediate ceasefire, withdrawal of all troops behind armistice lines, and the reopening of the Suez Canal. In favor, 64. Against, 5. Abstentions, 6. The Assembly adjourns, but the delegates and staff, in 40 hours of unofficial discussion and negotiation, seek ways to give effect to their ceasefire resolution, to stop the military action which is continuing in Egypt. On November the 3rd, just before midnight, Lester B. Pearson of Canada makes a proposal.
Our longer-range purpose, which has already been referred to tonight, and which may ultimately, in its implications, be even more important, is to find solutions for the problems which, because we have left them unsolved over the years, have finally exploded into this fighting and conflict. And for that purpose, Mr. President, my delegation would like to submit to the Assembly a very short resolution, which I venture to read at this time. It is as follows. Bearing in mind the urgent necessity of facilitating compliance with the resolution A3256 of November the 2nd, requests, as a matter of priority, the Secretary General to submit to it within 48 hours a plan for the setting up, with the consent of the nations concerned, of an emergency international United Nations force to secure and supervise the cessation of hostilities in accordance with the terms of the above resolution.
In the early hours of November the 4th, the resolution passes without opposition. Next day, Israel agrees to a ceasefire. But the United Kingdom and French governments announced that certain Anglo-French operations with strictly limited objectives are continuing. And the same day, their forces enter Port Said and the Canal Zone. November the 6th, the Anglo-French forces order a ceasefire, and that night the fighting comes to an end. Port Said harbor is clogged with sunken ships. The Suez Canal is blocked at both ends and in several places along its length. 13 merchant ships and tankers from 7 countries are trapped in the useless waterway. Billions of tons of cargo must now take the long detour around the Cape of Good Hope. The vital flow of oil slows down, but already the United Nations is tackling the problems of clearing the canal. The next day, the Secretary General's report on the UNEF has been in the delegates' hands for 24 hours. He now formally introduces it at the Assembly.
I only wish to express my warm hope that a decision in line with my proposals will be taken promptly so as to permit us to get going. There shouldn't be left any uncertainty in the minds of people about the determination of the United Nations.
Mr. Lutfi of Egypt announces that his government accepts the proposal to establish a United Nations emergency force. Mr. Escalation of Denmark.
We have all of us studied it
with all the care this historical document deserves, and which the tremendous importance of its content makes obligatory.
Speaker after speaker, from large countries and from small, endorses the Secretary-General's plan to establish the force at once, with General Burns, a Canadian, as Chief of Command. Monsieur de Guéringaud of France.
The French government, therefore, like the great majority of the members of this Assembly, will support the draft resolution. We hope that the international force will be set up as soon as possible.
The report is adopted. 64 votes in favor, 12 abstentions, none against. Later, Mr. Selwyn Lloyd, British Foreign Secretary, states,
"Whatever may be thought of our actions or our motives, out of the painful discussions regarding them, there has come the idea of a United Nations force, the idea that the United Nations should act through an international force. The action which we took was of a strictly temporary character, designed to meet an emergency. It was not directed against Egyptian sovereignty or Egyptian independence. Therefore, we wish to withdraw as soon, I say again, as soon as the United Nations force is in a position to assume effectively the tasks assigned to it."
General Burns takes up his appointment, and on November 11th, 4 days after the Secretary-General's report, the Vanguard of the UNEF, 10 experienced military observers from Palestine, arrives in Port Said. An advisory committee of the General Assembly has been set up to assist the Secretary-General in planning the development of the UNEF.
I apologize for the heavy claim upon your time. However, I feel that we are all rewarded by the swift development of this force, which is so novel in international experience.
Dr. Ralph Bunch reports that unsolicited offers of troops are pouring in. 24 offers in all. 10 contingents will be accepted to make a total of 6,000 men. And so, for the first time in history, there is born a force whose sole aim is to police a ceasefire agreement and withdrawal of troops. A force to be used with the consent of the countries concerned. A force with no political bias or function. A force independent of the policies of any nation, working under the Secretary-General of the United Nations as a common trust. From countries in 5 continents, the soldiers of the new force come. From Canada, Colombia, Denmark, Finland, India, Indonesia, Norway, Sweden, Yugoslavia. Most of the contingents are airlifted as far as Italy by the United States Air Force. The Canadians supply their own airlift. The advance party of the Yugoslavs goes direct by air, the main body with equipment by sea to Port Said. At an air base in Naples lent by the Italian government, officials and troops begin to arrive. On a chilly, dark morning, 45 Danes board an air transport provided by Switzerland. 1 hour later, as dawn spreads over Vesuvius, 47 Norwegians take off. The United Nations airlift now begins. The troops' destination is Abu Suer, an Egyptian airfield and military base 10 miles west of the Canal and 30 miles south of the Anglo-French forward positions across the Canal. November the 15th, 1956, only 8 days after the resolution creating the United Nations Emergency Force, its first contingents land in the bright morning sunshine at Abu Suer. UN military observers and Egyptian officials await them. 92 soldiers, the first of 6,000. A new kind of army with a new kind of job. The world's first international force to police the peace under UN command. The UNEF's first job, to separate the invading forces from the Egyptians. The Anglo-French and Egyptian armies still face each other on the narrow causeway which carries the canal to Port Said. The Danes place themselves between the forces and create a buffer zone, which slowly moves forward as the Anglo-French forces withdraw up the canal to Port Said. November 21st, the first UN troops, Norwegians, leave Abu Suwair for Port Said.
We passed 2 white jeeps of the United Nations. We were entering the buffer zone where the Danes are. We saw the ships marooned in the canal, 13 of them. One was Eli Knutsen out of Haugesund. It was good to see that name so far from home. Then soldiers, British soldiers and French. They waved, and so we waved. They seemed friendly and not troubled. Then the train stopped. Trouble? The trouble was a camel. And then we went across the bridge into Port Said. There were many photographers to meet us, and many colonels, and a general even. We were famous that day, I can tell you. The people of Port Said were happy to see us. It was a strange day. For everyone, it was a day to remember.
At Abu Suwair, the rapid buildup of UN troops and supplies continues. Transports of the Royal Canadian Air Force and planes lent by the Italian Air Force now take over the airlift from the Swiss. It is only the end of the first 2 weeks, but already the airlift has transported close to 2,000 troops, including units from Canada, Colombia, Denmark, India, Norway, and Sweden. December 3rd. The Yugoslav Motorized Reconnaissance Battalion arrives at Port Said. It passes through the Anglo-French lines into the buffer zone, where the Indians have replaced the Danes. The Yugoslav armored cars and trucks move promptly into the Sinai desert to follow up the slow Israeli withdrawal. December the 8th. Troops from Colombia and Sweden now join the Danes and Norwegians in Port Said. The city is divided into sectors. The French hold Port Fouad across the harbor. The British hold the Port Said waterfront, from which they will make their withdrawal, and the international section. In the rest of the city, control is in the hands of the United Nations, working with the Egyptian police. The date for the Anglo-French departure is not yet known, and the city waits as the men of war swing quietly at anchor and huge troop ships mass under the statue of Ferdinand de Lesseps, builder of the Suez Canal. The streets in the Anglo-French sector are empty now. The banks and stores are closed. There have been incidents between the Anglo-French forces and the Egyptians. There have been killings. Port Said is a city of frightening silences and sounds. Even in the United Nations sector, where there is less tension and more life in the streets, UN patrols are occasionally fired on. December the 15th. Colombian soldiers decorate their Christmas creche in the schoolhouse, which is their barracks. December the 18th. Evacuation plans are discussed in Port Said by Anglo-French commanders and General Burns, but no date for the withdrawal has yet been announced. December the 19th. British units preparing to withdraw sell some of their vehicles to the United Nations, hard-pressed for transport. All the trucks are painted UN white and soon begin to appear in the Anglo-French sector as well as their own. To the soldiers of the UNEF, it looks as if the British-French withdrawal may not be too far away. December the 20th. The RAF hands over the airfield at Port Said to the UN.
I covered it for Acme Press. I asked the British commander, what do you call this ceremonial? Does it have a name? No, he said. Just made it up for the occasion. Never handed an airport over to the UN before, you know. And then they marched away. Home for Christmas, they said. Across the harbor at Port Fouad, those tough French legionnaires are handing over to the Colombians. And it's a real formal affair.
December the 22nd. And at dusk, the final Anglo-French withdrawal begins. By dawn, the harbor is empty of all but wrecks. Today, Port Said returns to life after 47 days of occupation. The troops of the United Nations begin to mix their roles, tourists as well as soldiers. Cairo and Alexandria, hundreds of extra police arrive to help the UN troops maintain order and protect property. Civil authority is quickly returned to the Egyptians. The people of Port Said celebrate the end of the occupation in the traditional Arab manner. Rifles handed out by the Egyptian government to civilians in thousands during the crisis now appear in the streets. In the 2 days after the withdrawal, 500,000 rounds of ammunition are fired off in celebration as citizens parade and the Egyptian army returns from beyond the buffer zone. The immediate job for the UN is to clear the canal. At headquarters, the Secretary General's Advisory Committee hears Mr. Cordier, just back from Cairo, report that all remaining problems have been ironed out and work can start at once. Heading the salvage team in Egypt is Lieutenant General Raymond A. Wheeler, formerly of the United States Army.
Where do we start, General?
I'll show you on the map. In the Port Said area, there are 23 wrecks. Everything from a small tug to the largest bucket dredger. In the long stretch from Port Said to Ismailia, there are 10 wrecks, including the Ferdinand Bridge, both spans of which are down in the channel. And Lake Timsa is a wreck clear across the channel, an LST, the Akka, loaded with cement. Between that point and Suez, as far as we know now, there are no serious wrecks. But in the Suez area, there are 5 in the center of the channel.
The UN assembles one of the largest salvage fleets in history. 31 ships from 7 countries outside the conflict, as well as some Anglo-French salvage ships, which left after the early stages. The first job outside Port Said is the Ferdan Railroad Bridge. A salvage team begins work on January the 2nd, 1957. By January 6th, a narrow channel is cleared to Port Said and through its harbor, and the 13 marooned merchant ships can be released from their 11-week bondage. The route to Port Suez at the other end of the canal still is badly blocked, so the ships must be gingerly turned and sent up the canal's only bypass, which is like a watery railroad siding, and on out into the open sea. January 11th, the Canadian aircraft carrier Magnificent arrives in Port Said with over 400 Canadian soldiers to join the 600 Canadians already here, and with a heavy cargo of material: 232 vehicles, 7 tons of ammunition, 4 light reconnaissance aircraft, 55,000 gallons of gasoline, and 300 tons of supplies, including beer for the troops. In the Sinai desert, the Yugoslavs have been following up the Israeli withdrawal. Now other UN troops whose work is finished in Port Said join them. Always ahead of the troops go the observation officers, most of them veterans of the Palestine Truce Commission, but now members of the UNEF, like Swedish Major Sven Karl Erik Bernander. The observation officers ride alone in their white jeeps across the lonely desert miles, watching for violations of the ceasefire and checking Israeli outpost positions to see that the conditions of the withdrawal are being met. The observation officers also make arrangements with the Israelis for the planned advances of the United Nations Emergency Force when they take over positions abandoned by the Israelis. January the 15th, another observation officer, Canadian Major Donald Morgan, at an Israeli roadblock. Agreement has been reached on the United Nations takeover of El Arish, a desert town on the approaches to the Gaza Strip. Major Morgan radios the Yugoslav armored column waiting in the rear, and they begin their advance. Major Morgan then goes ahead with an Israeli escort to make sure El Arish is cleared and that the Israelis retire to the next agreed-on position. Five miles behind the withdrawing Israelis, the Yugoslavs advance.
By the looks of things, there should be something about here. Ah. Right. We'll just shorten the old prod and take a good look, but not, of course, not, of course, until we clear a little desert. There. All clear. Now, what have we got here? Gently does it. Ah, looks like one of those plastic check babies. Anti-tank. I wonder, could the boys have booby-trapped it for us just for fun? Well, let's get the old Hoover on it and have a listen. No? Decent of them. Now, let's have a real deco it, baby. Mustn't get sand in her eyes. Ah, there we are. Now, let's get the fangs out of her, and she's tame as a kitten.
Mines are a real peril for the troops. Several UN men have been killed. The numerous fields are often unmapped, the boundary wires torn up. The small mine reconnaissance groups seek them out and report their positions to troops in the area, like this 7-man Swedish outpost. The Canadians fence off the fields for later clearing. January the 27th. Military police of the Mixed Provo Company, the UNEF's only multinational unit, pick up Colonel Walter Lundquist, Chief of Staff, and set out for the Israeli forward positions 25 miles east of El Arish. Here, over a period of 10 days, the United Nations supervises an exchange of prisoners of war between Egypt and Israel, with the International Red Cross observing. Mrs. Chaim Weizmann, widow of Israel's first president, is on hand to greet the Israeli prisoners delivered by the UN. And then that day's allotment of Egyptian prisoners is marched up from behind Israeli lines and signed over to the UN. As a breather from duties, troops of the UNEF take the tour of the pyramids. There's time for it now. The British and French have left Egypt. All but a few UNEF troops have left Port Said and moved to the Sinai. The Israelis remain only in the Gaza Strip and Sharm el-Sheikh. The UNEF has worked well, swiftly, competently, and almost without serious incidents. While they wait for the Israeli withdrawal, the troops patrol the bleak Sinai, more for training reasons than for anything else. The change from pressure of duty is welcome. When the troops are not training, they have a chance at last to do the things they've wanted to do, to get caught up. In February, when the Brazilians arrive in Port Said with 480 troops and 310 tons of equipment, there is still no news of the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza and Sharm el-Sheikh. At the big Abu Suwair base, service troops and mechanics are still busy, maintaining the trucks against the ravages of the desert. Sand wrecks engines and gears quickly, and the desert roads, demolished by the withdrawing Israelis, pound the frames relentlessly. Tons of supplies are transported across the Sinai to the troops in the front lines, and everything is in readiness for the final move. But in the desert, the troops still watch and wait. The conditions under which Israel is prepared to withdraw from Sharm el-Sheikh and Gaza are not accepted by the UN. And while demonstrations are held in Jerusalem, the General Assembly reaffirms its appeal for unconditional withdrawal. The United States delegate reiterates his country's position.
We do not believe that any member is entitled to exact a price for his compliance with the elementary principle of this organization, that all members shall refrain from the use of force against the territorial integrity of any state or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. The United States again urges Israel to heed the call of the General Assembly and promptly complete the withdrawal of its forces.
Israel's doubts remain. She wants guarantees that the Gaza Strip will be no longer used as a base for Egyptian raids against her. She wants her ships to have freedom through the Gulf of Aqaba, previously denied her by Egyptian guns at Sharm el-Sheikh. As the stalemate continues, conflicting views are heard about the precise role of the UNEF. In New York, one of its architects speaks out in its defense.
Our United Nations force is in being. It's operating effectively now under the blue flag of peace of the United Nations. It's no threat to the sovereignty of any nation. And whatever we may say here in debate, it expects, and I feel sure that it will receive, the cooperation of the peoples and the governments in the countries in which it operates for one purpose only, the prevention of conflict and the creation of an atmosphere which will make possible a peace settlement. This force can do a great new work for peace in the area if we give it the chance. I hope that this resolution will give the United Nations and its emergency force that chance.
And still the troops in the desert await orders for their final move. Then, on March the 4th, the Israeli foreign minister speaks to the assembly.
Mr. President, the government of Israel is now in a position to announce its plans for full and prompt withdrawal from the Sharm el-Sheikh area and the Gaza Strip. We propose that a meeting be held immediately between the Chief of Staff of the Israel Defense Army and the commander of the United Nations Emergency Force in order...
Generals Burns and Diane translate the New York decisions into map coordinates, routes, areas, and dates. At staff meetings in UNEF headquarters, the long-ready plans are set in action. How many men? How much equipment? What kind of equipment? Where? When? As an observation officer looks on, the Israeli forces head for home, 127 days after they burst into the Sinai. Before dawn on March the 6th, 1957, the troops of the UNEF pack their gear and form up in columns on the main road to Gaza to take over from the withdrawing Israelis. At 2007 hours, the order is given and the advance begins. At a meeting attended by the mayor, Israeli civil affairs officers, and Egyptian civic leaders, the UNEF commanders make the necessary arrangements for such matters as water supply, food, billeting, curfew hours, and administration.
Proclamation. To the people of the Gaza Strip, greetings and peace be unto you. Until further arrangements are made, the UNEF has assumed responsibility for civil affairs in the Gaza Strip. I call upon all the people of the Gaza Strip to help the UNEF carry out its responsibilities. You are to remain quiet You are to remain law-abiding and orderly. You are not to carry arms or explosives of any kind. You shall continue to observe the present curfew hours until further notice. Peace and the mercy of God upon you.
As the role of the UNEF becomes understood by the people of Gaza, the tense and riotous atmosphere of the first day changes. The demonstrations continue, but they have lost their violence, and the UNEF troops are now warmly welcomed. In Sharm el-Sheikh, overlooking the Gulf of Aqaba, Finnish soldiers of the UNEF stand by as Israeli forces withdraw. The final Israeli withdrawal does not, of course, end Middle East problems, such as the plight of almost 1 million Arab refugees from Palestine, who have been fed and maintained by the United Nations for 9 years. In New York, Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld holds a press conference.
Sir, are you going to Cairo with any new plan for lessening the threat of war in that area?
No new plan. There is a good time-honored one which was established long ago and which I tried to get accepted last year. I'll continue on that line. The plan is just simply that step by step we must tackle the various concrete problems which are at the root of the whole difficulty. And if we have some patience and may I add some humility, I think we'll get through.
March the 25th, 1957. As officials look on, the sunken tug Edgar Bonnet is raised by 6 Dutch salvage vessels. The raising of this tug clears the canal for normal shipping. And on March the 29th, the first convoy in 5 months sails up the world's most important waterway. The orders were carried out. This was the result. This was the way it looked. The ADL, the Armistice Demarcation Line. This is the frontier for the troops of the United Nations Emergency Force. A frontier of vigilance against infiltrators. A frontier also of innocent Bedouin nomads who recognize no frontier. A frontier where men must be diplomats as well as soldiers. It is a frontier of minefields to be located and cleared. A frontier where perhaps a single false move can bring an international explosion. A frontier where the opposing forces watch tensely, and the men of the United Nations Emergency Force are in the middle. To this frontier, these men brought peace.